Grace and peace to you from the one who is, and who was, and who is to come. Early on the morning of July 11, 1958, police in Central Point, Virginia, burst into a house, acting on an anonymous tip. They found the criminals they were looking for, Richard and Mildred Loving. Richard was a white man, and Mildred was a woman of color. Their marriage violated the state of Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924. Richard and Mildred pled guilty, and they were given the choice of a year in prison or leaving their home state of Virginia for at least 25 years. They left their home and moved away. 6 years later, in the midst of the civil rights movement, Mildred wrote to Attorney General Robert Kennedy and asked if there was any way they could move back home. Kennedy connected them with lawyers who wanted to make their situation a test case, a chance for courts to make a ruling that would set a precedent for other similar situations that would follow. Richard and Mildred agreed. Their case eventually landed in front of the U.S. Supreme Court under the title Loving versus Virginia. The court ruled unanimously that laws banning interracial marriage were unconstitutional. The test case of Loving versus Virginia set a precedent for striking down laws that ban interracial marriage. And while many people in 2018 take the right to marry someone of any color for granted, setting that precedent was far from easy. The gospel for today begins from there Jesus set out. The gospel is referring to is the dinner table, where the Pharisees had insisted that particular practices and certain foods established a boundary between what was sacred and what was profane, between what made people ready to stand in God's presence and what made people unfit to stand in God's presence. Jesus argued there is nothing outside of a person that by going in can make him unfit to stand in God's presence. Instead, he asserted what comes out of a person is what makes him unfit to stand in God's presence. Jesus overturned the traditions about sacred and profane when it came to ritual washings and types of food. From there, Jesus set out and ventured into the region of Tyre. If Jesus was looking for a test case to see whether his ruling that overturned traditions about sacred and profane applied to people as well, an opportunity to set a precedent, this would be the place to find it. Tyre was populated mostly by Phoenicians. Unlike Galilean farmers, Phoenician merchants and sailors did fairly well under Roman rule. Like the other nations that surrounded Israel, the Phoenicians had many gods and their own ideas of what was clean and what was unclean. And on top of the economic and cultural differences, the two nations had fought on opposite sides during the Jewish revolt against the Greek king, the one that's commemorated at Hanukkah. The Phoenicians' relationship to their Jewish neighbors was complicated at best. While he was in the region around Tyre, Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there. But as has been the case for the last 2,000 years, nothing could hide Jesus. A mother burst into the house, acting on a tip that there was someone there who could heal her daughter. She found who she was looking for, Jesus of Nazareth. The woman had a little girl with an unclean spirit, and when she came to Jesus, she fell at his feet. As Mark tells the story, he goes over the top to emphasize what makes this a test case for whether Jesus' ruling that overturned traditions about sacred and profane applied to people as well. After already explaining that Jesus was in the land of the Phoenicians, Mark tells us, now this woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth. This would be like me saying, when I was in Mexico City, someone came into the house to talk to me. Now, the guy was Hispanic, Mexican by birth. Mark wants to leave no confusion on the fact that the person who came to Jesus would fall into that profane category on many counts. Socially, she was a woman approaching a man she didn't know in a culture that frowned on that sort of thing. Politically, she was a person from a group that collaborated with an occupying power, approaching someone from a group that was oppressed by that same occupying power. Economically, there's a good chance she was a more affluent person approaching a poorer person. And religiously, She was a Gentile who didn't observe any of the traditions about what was sacred and profane that Jesus would have grown up with. As a test case for whether Jesus' overturning traditions about sacred and profane applied to people as well, this mother of a sick child checked just about every box in the profane category. She asked him to heal her daughter, and he said to her, "Let the children eat their fill first, because it's not right to take the children's food and throw it to dogs." Over the years, scholars have spilled a lot of ink trying to find a way to get Jesus off the hook for calling a mother asking him to heal her sick child a dog. I, for one, think they have wasted that ink. Calling a woman a female dog was exactly the same then as it is now. The fact of the matter is that when he was presented with a test case to see whether his overturning traditions about sacred and profane applied to people, Jesus did not set the precedent we expect, at least not right away. Like an attorney arguing before the Supreme Court, this mother asking for help for her sick child made a counter-argument. "Lord," she said, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." The mother cited God's overflowing abundance and God's intent for all of creation to flourish as evidence for Jesus to take into account in this test case. She was arguing that God's power to heal was not a limited resource, that God's grace was given so generously that it spilled right off the table. Taking this evidence and argument into account, Jesus set a crucial precedent in this test case. He said to her, "On account of what you said, go. The demon has left your daughter." Through Jesus' decision in this test case, the traditions about sacred and profane, the ones Jesus had overturned when it came to ritual washings and food, were now overturned when it came to people. The distinction between people who could receive God's blessings and people who couldn't had been declared null and void. Like the test case of Loving versus Virginia, the test case of the Syrophoenician mother versus Jesus led to a change that blessed people. But it was not an easy experience for people at the heart of that case. In the same way that Richard and Mildred Loving faced difficulty and challenge as their case played out, this mother who came seeking help for her sick child faced rejection and insult as she pled her case. The Census Bureau reports that 1 in 10 married couples in the United States today is interracial or interethnic. This means there's a pretty good chance you know someone whose life has been changed by that test case of Loving versus Virginia that made their marriage legal everywhere in this country. But nearly everyone in this room right now has had his or her life changed by the test case of the Syrophoenician mother versus Jesus. This test case overturned the distinction between people who could receive God's blessings and people who couldn't. Jesus' decision on this test case set the precedent for Gentiles, for you and for me, to be fully part of God's kingdom, to receive its blessings and to participate in its creation. Jesus' ruling on this test case certainly blesses us, but the same precedent also challenges us. What are the distinctions that we see, sense, or speak about that Jesus' ruling declares null and void? What differences and boundaries does Jesus' ruling invite us to overcome and to cross over? In the same way that Jesus served and blessed somebody who was so different from him, we too are called to offer loving service to people who may be very different from us. Early on the morning of July 11th, 1958, police in Central Point, Virginia burst into a house, acting on an anonymous tip. The chain of events that started that morning would turn into the test case of Loving versus Virginia that changed millions of lives in America. One day, generations ago, a mother in Tyre burst into a house, acting on a tip that someone was there who could heal her daughter. The chain of events that began in that house turned into the test case of the Syrophoenician mother versus Jesus that would change countless lives including the lives of almost everyone here today. The test case she brought to Jesus spurred him to set a precedent that his ruling, overturning traditions, separating sacred and profane practices and foods, those that were fit for God's blessing and those that weren't, also applied to people. Jesus' ruling in this test case challenges us to rethink which people we believe are fit to receive God's blessing as well. But more than anything, Jesus' ruling blesses us because in this test case, Jesus rules that we are fit to receive God's promises. The promise of forgiveness, the promise of new life now, and the promise of resurrection life to come. Thanks be to God.